I remember the chair was too tall for me. I remember that my feet didn't reach the floor, and I remember thinking I should mention it to someone, and then deciding it wasn't worth the trouble. That was the first morning at Dreneth. I was 11 years old, and still carrying the smell of the transit depot on my clothes, machine oil, and recycled Atmo, and the particular cold you only get when a station's heating grid is one relay from failing. My mother had kept it running for 9 years, with parts that were never meant to fit together. I had handed her tools since I was 4. They sat me in the central evaluation wing at 0700. The room was high-ceilinged and white, and full of a clean, sourceless light that felt like it was trying too hard. 14 cadets from 4 other intake cohorts were seated at their own stations across the room. Vel Sorvani, Keth Vorathi, 2 species I didn't have names for yet. The stations were arranged in a loose arc, each with a data panel and a central interface column. Mine was positioned at the far end. Assessor Kel Vethorvan introduced himself from the elevated platform at the room's front. He was tall, pale blue, with bioluminescent dorsal stripe crests that ran from his jawline to the base of his skull. 3 of them, usually lit amber. He told us the Sovereign Tier Assessment System would evaluate tactical cognitive aptitude across 7 ascending tiers. He told us that completing Tier 4 was considered strong performance. Tier 5 was exceptional. Tier 6 had been reached by fewer than 2% of subjects across the battery's history. He did not say anything about Tier 7. I found out later it was because no one had ever needed to. Tier 1 was a routing problem. 3 supply chains, 6 nodes each, variable load tolerance, 3 disruption events injected mid-sequence. I had been running versions of that problem in my head since I was 6. The depot's freight calendar was exactly that structure, except the disruption events were real, and the consequences for getting it wrong were that cargo sat unsorted, and my mother got a message from the Port Authority at 2 in the morning. I cleared Tier 1 in 4 minutes. The panel registered completion. Veth Orvan's stripe crests shifted, amber to something cooler, a pale greenish-white I didn't have a name for. His secondary eyelids blinked once. I would come to understand that blink as a Vel Sorvani involuntary tell for mild surprise, but I didn't know that yet. I just noticed it and moved on. Tier 2 was pattern extraction, a long sequence of tactical formations drawn from an alien operational history I'd never studied, asking me to identify the underlying decision logic across a set of apparent variations. It was the kind of problem that was supposed to require months of curriculum study to crack, but the logic was just logistics with violence attached. If you stripped out the combat framing, the underlying question was the same one I'd worked out every time we had 3 freighters trying to dock at a 2-bay terminal. What is the actual constraint, and which rule is hiding it? I cleared Tier 2 in 11 minutes. The cadet to my left, a Vel Sorvani with gold-flecked stripe crests, glanced over at my panel, and then away again, quickly. I was aware, dimly, that the room had gone quieter, not completely quiet. Keyboards still moved, panels still registered input, but the particular sound of focused, stressed work had softened into something else, something more attentive. Tier 3 was the first one that made me sit back for a moment. It was a system failure cascade, 17 interdependent nodes, variable failure propagation rates, the task being to find a sequence of interventions that stabilized the system before cascade completion. The timer was set to 40 minutes. I looked at it for probably 90 seconds, because I was trying to figure out why one of the node connections felt wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being difficult, wrong in the sense that the weight assigned to that connection seemed miscalibrated relative to the others, which meant the cascade's published propagation rate was slightly off, which meant the correct intervention sequence the system was probably expecting would work, but would leave the network in a degraded state rather than a stable one. I filed the intervention sequence that actually stabilized it, fully stabilized, 18 minutes. Veth Orvan stepped down from his platform. I saw him do it in my peripheral vision. He crossed the room to my station and stood behind me for a few seconds, reading my panel. He didn't say anything. He went back up. Tiers 4 and 5 I remember less clearly. That sounds strange to say, but they were the tiers that most resembled things I'd actually done, rather than things I'd done adjacent to, and so they moved through me in a way that felt less like solving and more like recognizing. Tier 4 was multi-source resource allocation under adversarial pressure. Tier 5 was decision sequencing in an environment where the information feed was partially corrupted, and I had to weight the reliable signals against the degraded ones. The depot's sensor grid had run degraded for most of my childhood, because the replacement components were backordered for 3 years. You learn to read partial data. You develop an instinct for which corrupted signal is noise, and which corrupted signal is noise that's pointing at something real. I cleared Tier 4 in 22 minutes, Tier 5 in 31. By the time I submitted Tier 5, the room had effectively stopped. I became aware of it gradually. The sound of other input had ceased, and when I looked up, 14 cadets across the arc of stations were watching my panel, or watching me, with the particular stillness of people who have set their own work down because something more important was happening. Veth Orvan's stripe crests were cycling through colors I didn't have vocabulary for. His secondary eyelids were moving in a slow, rhythmic pattern that I would later learn was a Vel Sorvani attempt to regulate a response that was involuntary. He was trying to look calm. He was not entirely succeeding. The system loaded Tier 6. I remember being aware, for the first time that morning, that this one was supposed to mean something. Not because it was harder, but because the structure of it was different. The previous tiers had been problems with identifiable correct answers. Tier 6 was a scenario with no correct answer, only better and worse ones, and the evaluation wasn't measuring whether I solved it, but how I navigated a framework that was designed to resist resolution. It was built to reveal how a mind responded to irresolvable constraint. I found the secondary axis. The scenario was constructed around a primary strategic dilemma, but running underneath it was a resource allocation problem that the scenario's authors had embedded as flavor text. They'd intended it as irrelevant background detail. It wasn't irrelevant. Solving the resource allocation problem changed the constraints of the strategic dilemma in a way that didn't resolve it, exactly, but collapsed the range of its possible outcomes to a much narrower band, one where the worst-case result was survivable rather than terminal. I submitted at 47 minutes. I remember thinking it had taken longer than I would have liked. The room was completely still. The Solvereign tier assessment system ran for a few seconds. I heard the faint processing tone it made between tier transitions. I had heard it 5 times already that morning. I waited for Tier 7 to load. It didn't load. The panel showed a result field. The result field was blank. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked up at Veth Orvan. "Is there another one?" I asked. The silence in the room had a texture to it that I didn't fully understand at 11. I understand it better now. It was the silence of 14 cadets in the process of revising a category. It was the silence of a Vel Sorvani assessor with 91 years of institutional history behind him, watching that history develop a new column. Veth Orvan's stripe crests had gone a color I had never seen before on any living thing in any species. They held that color for a long moment. Then he blinked, both sets of eyelids, the outer and the inner, and looked at me, and said, very carefully, that he would need to file a notation. I told him that was fine. I asked if I could get some water while he did. He sent a junior proctor to find me water. The junior proctor moved faster than the situation probably required. The result field on my panel stayed blank. Somewhere across the room, the Vel Sorvani cadet with the gold-flecked crests was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Years later, when I was assigned to the faculty of that same wing, I looked up the notation Veth Orvan filed that morning. It was 3 sentences long. The third sentence was a request for guidance from the evaluation committee on how to populate a result field that the system's architecture had never been built to receive input for. The committee met. They discussed it for 6 weeks. They added a field. I don't know what they put in it. By then, I had stopped caring about the category and started caring about the work. The work was what it had always been, the next problem, whatever it was, and whether I could find the axis that the authors hadn't seen. I usually could.